Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobby, and today, productivity. It's going nowhere, and nobody seems to be able to figure out why. The UK government has launched an industrial strategy to try and tackle the problem. So will the right sort of a government investment help? Or is the problem something more fundamental than that? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Well, in the 1960s, productivity growth each year in the UK was close to 3%. In the 70s, 80s and 90s, it was 2%. In this century, it's dropped to less than 1%. And in the first 2 quarters of this year, it's actually fallen. It's actually negative. Could that be because some of the most productive people are now moving home to Europe? Well, maybe, but no, because it's been happening for a while, as we've seen, and it's a similar story throughout the world. In Australia, for example, labour productivity was more than 2% right up to the last few years. From 2013, it fell below 1%. Now there, many people blame it on the economy's structural change. But what's the UK's excuse? In fact, across all OECD countries, productivity growth from 2015 to 2016 averaged less than 0.5%, 0.2% for the United States. You see the problem? So what's happening here, Steve?
Well, I think it's actually a definition of productivity is the ratio of output to the number of people employed.
Yeah.
We've got labour productivity. And that is statistically, it makes, it's an obvious comparison. What are the number of units of output per unit of labour input? But in the modern economy, this comes back to my arguments about energy again, labour is not the productive factor.
Yeah.
It's energy harnessed by machinery. And consequently, you can have a dramatic increase in the number of people employed and a fall in the energy throughout in machinery at the same time.
Hang on. Wouldn't it go the other way? I mean, if you had more machines doing more stuff and you had fewer people employed, you'd expect productivity to increase. Because as you say, it's output per hour worked. If machines are doing a lot of the work and there's fewer people, you'd expect the productivity to be increasing, wouldn't you? Yeah,
which is the thing is what's happening, the machines are not being installed.
Right.
So it actually comes down to the fact that the way we define it is output divided by the number of workers. You could have rising amount of output being produced by hiring more machines, and therefore the number of workers having a job going down, the output going up, and therefore a dramatic recorded increase in labour productivity. What we've seen is a fall in labour productivity. What that translates as is more and more people are being hired. So we're seeing a very, very low level of unemployment in the UK in particular, and a low level in America too. But the level of actual investment in physical productivity and capital has declined.
Right.
So we have more people doing really creative things, like, for example, selling second-hand houses to each other, or even better, selling second-hand shares to each other. And consequently, that doesn't turn up in GDP, but it does employ people. So the measure of recorded labour productivity is falling. The conventional interpretation is people aren't working as hard, they're not being as productive, et cetera, get a life. What's actually going on is because aggregate demand has been so low, except for assets, which of course the demand's coming larger, being spooked by central banks. There's a decline in the level of investment in actual physical productivity.
Right. So we're selling stuff that's not stuff that we've made. So we're being less productive from that point of view. So that makes perfect sense, and that would explain why over many decades, because we've seen asset prices increasing over the last 30 years or so. But what about this whole thing about since the global financial crisis? So if we look at the US, for example, the manufacturing sector grew at its productivity grew at 3.2% from 1987, but over the last 5 years, it's increased just 0.5%, and we can point to figures like that all over the world. Since the global financial crisis, is that just because of the uncertainty? We're just not investing in the plant and machinery anymore.
Partially. I mean, it's also because there is a demographic thing in terms of total output, in terms of output per head. Then it does come down to whether you're actually investing or not. And one of the weird things that comes out of my little mathematical model, the Minsky model I've done, which is the foundation of my overall economic analysis, is that if you have a runaway level of private debt, because capitalists are more willing to invest than another situation where private debt doesn't explode, what you actually get is a lower rate of growth. So with absolutely no change in the labor in the rate of growth of labor productivity, which is in my models. At the moment, I haven't built a feedback between the rate of profit and the rate of change of labor productivity, which would therefore mean the rate of increase in the productive capability of machinery. Even with a fixed level there, so you don't have a decline in technological capability. What you get is a lower rate of actual investment. And this is one of the reasons you have to understand complex systems rather than just using straight old linear thinking, which is the way neoclassical economists think. You would think that a higher desire to invest by capitalists would mean a higher rate of innovation and a higher rate of growth. In our system, what it actually means is they're more willing to borrow money to invest. They therefore do borrow the money to invest. That increases the claims that the financial sector has on the income of the total income of the society. It actually ends up meaning that because that claim fluctuates over time, you get a declining level of investment. So because a higher desire to invest means a lower level of investment.
Because you owe that money still to the finance sector. Right. So
and it's if I want to take it as far back, you can see in Ricardo, one of the reasons Ricardo developed the theory of comparative advantage was that he wanted to eliminate the profits of the landlords and transfer as much money as possible into the hands of capitalists so that we would have more innovation and investment going on there. Because Ricardo did not understand banking, he little Shell and Petrie convinced everybody about the nature of where growth came from, which was another fallacy. But what he was correct to say, you don't want money getting into the hands of rentiers who fundamentally will just use it on profligate living. So in that sense, the rentiers of his day were the landlords. The rentiers of our days are the bankers. The rentiers of his day spent their money on carriages and, I imagine, snuff. And the rentiers of today spend it on Lamborghinis, and I don't need to imagine. I know it's cocaine. So we end up we end up snorting what should be going into increasing physical productive capacity.
Right. Okay. So if I've got this right, I mean, so the primary reason that it sounds, in part, it's because yes, we've had a bit of uncertainty since the global financial crisis, so companies might be a little bit more reticent to invest in plant and machinery. But even when they're borrowing the money from the banks. They may be increasing their output as a result of that plant and machinery, but then they owe a whole chunk of money back to the banks, so the banks are claiming a chunk of that value that's being created. So we're not seeing productivity increase because it's just going back to the banks. That's in effect what you're saying.
Effectively saying that, there's too much of the money, as Ricardo himself feared, too much of the money is going to the rentier, the profligate class, and not enough is going to the capitalist, the investing class, and innovating class. And as complicated as the argument is, that particular insight is correct.
So I wonder whether that also, I mean, that subdues the amount of money that you have available to pay people who you do need to work to work these machines. And we've seen prices subdued. And I'm wondering if there's a bit of feedback on that as well. Are people less productive because they're not getting so much money these days?
Well, they're less productive because they're not being hired to produce anything. And this is the other element of it. I hate how everything I say comes back to debt because I sound like I'm a one-horse pony. I have at least 2 horses. But the fundamental truth is there out of this very simple model of mine, which I now regard actually as being the equivalent to Lorenz's model in meteorology. What I see is the rising level of debt means the falling workers' share of GDP. The crisis, when it comes along, involves a collapse in profit share. That only happens at the very end of the whole cycle, however. But over the period of time that the crisis is developing, the rising level of debt causes a declining amount being paid to workers, and it also causes a lower level of investment. So by letting the private debt system get out of control, which is what's happened in the last 40 years, we've had a lower level of growth. That's the real cause of the decline in labour productivity. Well, there is a lot more to this discussion on productivity. If you want to hear it in full, then you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. Pick one of the plans on the right-hand side of the website, or become a supporter of Steve on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen. Anyone who provides support of $10 or more per month to help Steve with his work, they get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. We'll be back again soon with another one when we look at the idea of a debt jubilee. How will that work in practice? That's next time on the Debunking Economics podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.